Thank you so much, Randy. It's always incredible to hear my life. Thank you all for gathering here today, too. I really appreciated Matt Fox's talk yesterday and the many fine points he raised. So I hope today to do is sort of almost to build on what he was saying. But the way I like to approach this is the fact that we are forming a new narrative. And I do think, stories shape our lives. And a lot of the Christian story that many of us grew up with was a particular story that really gave meaning and shape to our lives, and now that story seems to be unraveling. But there's a new story, I think, that is emerging. And so that's what I want to share with you this morning. Where are we coming out of? What is that old story that keeps a lot of people still tethered to the past and to a framework that's no longer operative today? And what's the new story that's emerging? So I'm going to do that in a way that we can begin to look at love as the deepest reality of our cosmic life together. Now let's take a look at what the news, shows us quite often these days. It's a world in conflict. It's a world in radical conflict where even some of the, racial biases, the white supremacy, the things that, in a sense, we thought we moved beyond in the late 60s and 70s, now are resurging, with a greater force than ever. Coupled with that, as Matt brought up yesterday, and many people now know, is global warming. I was just reading yesterday that the number of carbons in the atmosphere in 2018 increased by 3%. So it's actually getting warmer. It's not going away after all the discussions we've had and our enlightenment. And we know that global warming is affecting various parts of the world in terms of drought, various numbers of species that are being migrated from their ecological niches and some going extinct. The Arctic pole is warming, and that will really shift geologically, the shape of the Earth. And the poor are being affected by this disproportionately. And you think to yourself, well, what is this? I mean, how is it we can know about this stuff, and there's something about us that does not change? We know that the crisis that we're undergoing is a deteriorating one, so that, we're looking at a type of loss of life that will not, in a sense, return to life. Once it's lost, it's really lost. So there's something about our footprint that is entirely too large. As many, if you've taken the ecological footprint test, which is how much meat you eat, where you live, how much you drive, how much water you drink, it would take about 6 planets for everyone to live like a North American. So, part of this story, I think, is that we're coming out, if I can put it this way, we are in probably one of the most significant paradigm shifts in the history of civilization, certainly in the human history. We are coming out of a type of consciousness that was known as first axial consciousness. That kind of consciousness that gave, in a sense, birth to the individual. And that our first axial consciousness is distinguished from pre-axial consciousness, which is the consciousness of Native American spirituality, tribal spirituality. First axial consciousness really emerged with the Greeks, with a sense of space, as well as time and the geography of the earth. So Christianity, like Judaism and Islam, these are first axial religions. And here's an image of the Hebraic universe, which is, for the most part, still a lot of people's universe when it comes to religion, right? The earth is at the center. God is above. Down below is Sheol, which Dante gave the name to hell. And God is the geometer, right? God is the one who orders all things. So, the old maxim, pay, pray, obey, and you'll get to heaven, right? And do what? I don't know, probably have a nice long cup of coffee and hang out there. Medieval cosmology is our religious cosmology still to this day. There's no doubt about it. Even as we become more enlightened, there's something about this cosmology that has become deeply imprinted in our minds. And it's a geocentric cosmology, right? So the earth is at the center, and of course, the human is at the center of the earth. And we're surrounded by the planets and the suns and the stars. And this cosmology had a beauty to it in the sense that the human and the cosmos formed a harmonious whole. And that's why someone like Francis of Assisi could go about and find God in the beautiful things of creation. But this cosmology also had to it a kind of what we might call a Neoplatonic Ascent, the primacy of the spiritual or the spirit over the material. In other words, the whole materiality points to the fullness of spirituality. So we had a kind of transcendent nature, a transcendent relation to nature. And the old maxim, lex orandi, the law of prayer. Lex credendi is the law of belief. And lex vivendi is the law of life. So we would say, holy God, holy and mighty, the God who reigns over all is the God we want to ascend to. And so we would go into that beautiful cathedral in Washington, D.C., the National Cathedral. And who's looking at the floor, right? The first thing you do is you go, wow, look how high those ceilings are, and look at the stained glass all the way up there, and there's, a piece of the moon up there. So your attention is lifted from the earth to heaven. And that kind of reinforced attention away from the earth and towards heaven has become a very kind of operative attention span. So even today, if I say the word God, or heaven, just the word, people are like, there. And I'm like, what's there? There's no there there. There is here. All right? Well, we don't, just hang on, Story gets better. Well, we know that, in the late 15th, 16th centuries, as we began to develop a telescope, we could begin to measure the movement of the planets a little bit better. Copernicus began to speculate that maybe the Earth was not the center of the cosmos, that perhaps it seemed the sun was center. And of course, Copernicus was a very faithful Polish Catholic, the priest, and a friend of the Pope. And the Pope's like, Nick, nice idea, do not publish that one, all right? So I always say he kind of buried it under his pillow with the tooth fairy. And Kepler came along, and Tycho Brahe came along. They're like, definitely, this is definitely heliocentric. And then came Galileo. And I always say it always takes a good Italian, because he's like, yeah, what's the problem? So he wrote this great big book called The Dialogue of the Two Great World Systems. There's the Ptolemaic system, which is the medieval cosmos, and then there's the Copernican system, which is heliocentrism. And Galileo said, there's really no conflict. It's just that this is a better model. Right? That's all we're saying. This is a better model of what our cosmos is. Cardinal Bellarmine was not happy. And in 1633, he said, the doctrine attributed to Copernicus, namely that the earth moves around the sun and the sun stands at the center of the world without moving from east to west. This is contrary to Holy Scriptures and therefore cannot be defended or held. Because Scripture, in a sense, never really said that the earth was center, by the way. It just said that God created everything within unfolding time. But Galileo was arguing this at the time of the Protestant Reformation. And he looked like another Luther or Calvin. right, basically. And the church was like, this is it. We're losing our grip on authority. No one's paying attention to us anymore. Galileo, you're under house arrest. Now, house arrest in Florence, Italy, truthfully, to me, that's retirement. So, lucky him. Here's what I think Galileo did. It's really, he was a scientist, right? He had a great eye and a great genius for mathematics, and he was saying that science reveals to us the world as it is, not just appearances, as Plato might have said. It's about observation. The world is good, but it can also be observed and measured. So what Galileo did is he shifted the question, not to just where is everything moving toward, ultimately heaven, but why are things moving at all? So he introduced efficient causality, and this efficient causality really gave rise to a mechanical view of nature. And what Galileo said is very true. Science and religion are not in conflict at all. He says the Bible tells us how to go to heaven, not how the heavens go. The Bible is not a science book, all right? Do not read it that way. Well, as science began to arise, because science began to develop tools. So I want you to just keep in mind that technology has always been part of science and human discovery. It's not like a 21st century thing. So as we began to use mathematics and tools, we could begin to explain things that formerly we would invoke the name of God. Well, how did that work? Well, God did it, Well, why does this move? Well, God makes things move. Now we can say, no, here are the forces that makes things move. So God seemed to be pushed out of this cosmos almost as an unnecessary hypothesis. Do we really need to talk about God when we can explain these things? What I think happened is we grew up since the 16th century with cognitive dissonance, if not just maybe outright schizophrenia of some sort, We have a religious consciousness, a religious brain, and a scientific brain. I mean, we're all immersed in a scientific technological culture. And yet, there's so many people who are, all about God and original sin and, he's coming to save us and the rapture and we're all going to heaven and this type thing. Well, that story worked well in that old cosmos. But we're living in something new. And of course, Descartes added to this story. Now, Descartes was a French Jesuit trained, a mathematician, a philosopher, deeply concerned with the knowledge and truth. What is truth? What is true knowing? That was his big question. How do I know anything for certain? So certainly Descartes said, well, if the material world is changing, if this earth is spinning now around a sun, there can be no true and certain knowledge, can there? So what he basically did is he did an experiment. What if I separate my material self from my thinking self? And he said, I can think, and I know I exist. And if I exist, there must be one who is existence itself, namely God. But this has nothing to do with the material world. So Descartes basically split body and soul, matter and spirit. And therefore, I think what happened is the human person became the cosmos. Where before the cosmos was where what we were immersed in, now the whole thing was wrapped up in the self-thinking self. And this, in a sense, opened the way for natural science to proceed unrestricted, just what can be measured. Now, the natural world was not where sacred meaning could be found or God can be found. That search for God could only be found in my self-thinking self. So the whole weight, you might say, of religion was placed in the individual, apart from the cosmos. The cosmos was just like stuff, as Newton would say. And therefore, it led to this idea that God is not part of the material world. And we got to all sorts of notions of God there.